Okay, if we start number 4 here and we replace cosecant with 1 over sine, cotangent with cosine over sine, secant with 1 over cosine. At this point, you have a couple of choices. We could go ahead and multiply these two binomials together, or FOIL this. That's one option, and it'll certainly work. But perhaps recognizing that these two fractions already have same denominators will allow us to combine them into one fraction. That route might be simpler and take less steps. So I'm going to combine them into a single fraction. Now if you want to, we could go ahead and do the same thing over here. In order to combine these two, I would need to find a common denominator, which is cosine, so I need to change the number 1 to have that same denominator. And to do that, I'm going to change it to cosine over cosine, which is the same as 1. Now I can go ahead and add those together. And get a single fraction. At this point, these two fractions are separated by multiplication, so I'm going to multiply straight across. 1 minus cosine times 1 plus cosine. If you FOIL that, the middle terms will fall out, and you simply end up with 1 minus cosine squared. And if you multiply straight across in the denominators, it's sine b cosine b. So hopefully you recognize now that 1 minus cosine squared can be replaced, substituted with sine squared from our list of what to know above. And now if we cancel this sine with the squared, I'm left with sine over cosine, which we are going to change to tangent. Okay, turning this page over. Number 5. Everything in this problem has been changed, which means we need to add two fractions together. In order to add these two fractions together, you gotta have a common denominator. That common denominator is going to be these two denominators multiplied together. So this 1 minus cosine times 1 plus cosine, if you multiply them together, you get 1 minus cosine squared. And now we need to change the numerators. Whatever this denominator was multiplied by to get the new denominator, that's what you have to multiply the numerator by, which means we took this binomial, we multiplied it by him, now we need to multiply it by 1. So we simply get 1 plus cosine up here. Similarly, we're going to multiply this guy by him and him. That's where this came from. So this new numerator is 1 minus cosine A. And this will allow us to write a single fraction. 1 minus cosine squared is the common denominator. And on top I see that this guy cancels with this guy, so the number 2 is all that's left up there. So 1 minus cosine squared I'm going to now change to sine squared. So 2 over sine squared will be simplified to 2 cosecant squared. I would like to move on to a different type of problem, a different scale, so I'm going to slide down here to 7. You'll notice the secant, cosine, and sine, so secant is the one I'm going to change first. Secant is 1 over cosine. Everything else I'm going to leave and just rewrite it, the cosine and the sine. Okay, at this point what you need to recognize is this large fraction bar contains 3 items, and one of those items is a fraction. Well, if you ever have a fraction that contains smaller fractions, then fraction busters is a great method to simplify it and make it legal. So, to do fraction busters for this problem, you need to find a common denominator for the 3 items, for this one, and for this one. If you need visual help, putting these guys over 1 will help you find all the denominators, in this case cosine 1 and 1. So a common denominator for these 3 items is cosine. So I'm going to multiply everything in this fraction by cosine. That will relieve the fractions that are within the fraction. So cosine b, or beta, times 1 over cosine beta is just 1, because the cosines cancel. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared. And sine times cosine, we just simply write sine times cosine. Or cosine times sine, doesn't matter. So that was using fraction busters to make it legal and simplify it. Here's the 1 minus cosine squared. Again, so we're going to change that to sine squared. And now simplify sine with the squared. That leaves sine over cosine, which we change to tangent. Let's go ahead and do one more. We have time for one more. So let's go ahead and do 8 since it's right next door. Tangent, we change to sine over cosine. Now we need to subtract these 2 fractions. In order to subtract or add fractions, you must have a common denominator. The common denominator for this problem will be these 2 denominators multiplied together. I'm going to keep them separated rather than distributing them. You'll see why here later. If you change the denominator, you must change the numerator. So this cosine we multiplied by 1 minus sine, therefore we have to multiply cosine times cosine, and that gives us cosine squared. And we multiplied this cosine by 1 minus sine, so we have to multiply the sine by it. And I'm going to go ahead and distribute that. So sine times 1 is sine, and then sine times that sine is sine squared. And now I have same denominators. When we combine like terms in the top, this minus, we have to be very careful. It has to be distributed amongst that sine and the sine squared. So this minus and this negative become positive sine squared. Time to recognize that this cosine squared right here and this plus sine squared is equivalent to 1 from our notes of what we need to know. So I'm going to change those to the number 1, and that's what the numerator looks like. This is why we kept the bottom factored or separated, because at this point this binomial cancels with this binomial, and I'm left with 1 over cosine, which is secant.